Good evening and welcome back to 31 Horror Nights. It's October 23rd and tonight's movie is Resurrection. This is a psychological thriller from 2022 starring Rebecca Hall, who is also the star of The Night House, which is one of the better movies from last year's Horror Nights. This, it seems, is a lot like The Invisible Man, where this woman is being hunted by her ex-boyfriend. Except at this point, it's well after the fact. She has an adult child at this point. The trailer and every description of this movie is so unbelievably vague about this. It acts like there was like some sort of dark past with her, except it's him coming back that's the problem. So did they like commit crimes together or something? It frames him as the villain, so what does he want? Does he want to get back together with her? Rebecca Hall's character has a British accent, even though the movie takes place in New York, so I'm guessing that she literally moved to a different country in order to get away from this man. But I think I'm missing some context as to why this is such a big deal, why this is hyped up so much, why this is such an intense, psychologically traumatic thing that's happening. I suppose the only way to know is to give it a watch, so let me do that. Unexpectedly, this movie was bad. Like Megan from yesterday could be like funny bad at a few points, but this was just like bad. I'm giving it a 3 out of 10. And now we are batting 3 for 3 when it comes to bad main characters because I did not like the main character in this movie, Margaret, at all. Rebecca Hall did as good as she could have done with the source material. She even had her own trauma dump long take monologue. It was almost as long as the one from Pearl. It was, I think, like 7 minutes or so. But at right about the point that monologue was finished, her mental state began to decline. And even before that, she really didn't make a lot of sense. Her ex boyfriend is a man named David, and he does reveal himself to be a manipulative, gaslighting, abusive murderer. But there isn't really anything scary about him, nothing intimidating about him, and the main thing he uses to manipulate Margaret throughout the movie is something that I absolutely cannot take seriously. The movie kind of presents Margaret as like this like super uber girl boss who's like at the top of her game and she's making big moves at this biology company that she works at, and she has a daughter, and I thought that the daughter was an adult. She's almost 18, which is about the age that actress was in real life, but like still. And then her ex-boyfriend from 2 decades ago appears and everything gets like ground to a halt. She is so scared of him that just seeing him is enough to send her into a panic attack and make her literally run back home to check on her daughter. Also, I couldn't help but notice that the way that she runs is kind of goofy. Like her arms are like very stiff but still bent, and she moves them a lot. She sees him a few times in public, and he's able to taunt her by bringing back some of his old manipulation tactics. And she goes to the police, and I will give this movie credit for not having the police just be totally useless and incompetent. The guy that she's talking with does seem to believe her when she says that she thinks that he's coming back to intimidate her and that he might have bad intentions, but he says if he hasn't done anything yet, and he has only interacted with you in public spaces, there's nothing we really can do. And he wants to like give her advice on how to approach this the smart way. But I guess that without the police completely dropping the ball, Margaret decided that she was going to have to drop that ball herself. She is so needlessly secretive for no particular reason. Like, this is a very simple thing to explain. An abusive ex boyfriend from decades ago who hurt me deeply is back, and I'm scared he wants to do something to me and my child. If she had said that, things would have been a lot easier for her because she would just go on to behave erratically, act like a super overprotective helicopter parent to her daughter, Abby, and basically just drive away everybody who could help her. I almost thought that this was part of David's plan to just make her feel so afraid and paranoid with his mere presence that she uproots her own life and turns things upside down, but they never really indicate that. Instead, just like Gemma from yesterday's movie, Megan, Margaret just made all the wrong choices of her own accord. The first half of this movie was okay, but the second half, with Margaret's bad behavior and how on its face goofy the big plot point of this movie is, and I'll explain that during the spoiler section, but with those two things, the movie, like on a whole, just did not work, in my opinion at least. And now I want to talk about some spoilers. Margaret and David met 20 years before when she was like 18 or 19 and he was late 30s, early 40s, somewhere in there. And age gap relationships like this, the one where the younger party isn't even at the point where their brains are fully finished developing, like mid 20s, that is a red flag. It's not like necessarily abusive, but there is a power dynamic there that needs to be treated with care. And in this situation, David absolutely used that power dynamic to completely get Margaret under his thumb and like emotionally manipulate and abuse her. He had her doing a bunch of stuff for him, things that didn't even make sense. And he got her pregnant. And when they had a kid, she like really did love the kid and wanted to keep the kid. But when she left to go get food, he ate the baby, everything except for two fingers, and then told her that the baby was still alive in his stomach and the baby was mad at her for abandoning him. And I guess this was slow, gradual emotional abuse and manipulation to the point where she was starting to believe him and that she could hear the sound of the baby crying in his stomach, I guess. That's kind of hard for me to take seriously, but we didn't really see that part of it happen. She did eventually escape and would go to have a kid with, she doesn't even know who the father was, but have a kid of her own. And I don't know what he was doing for like the 20 years since that happened, but all of a sudden he's tracking her down and wants something from her. And he's still trying to leverage the idea of the baby somehow still being alive in his stomach 20 years later and is crying for her. And as the second half of the movie keeps going, she falls back into the manipulation again. And I know how cruel this sounds, but the fact that as like a 40-year-old woman, she was able to be convinced again that this was true and still true 20 years later, that's just so silly and so goofy, and I can't take that seriously. While this is happening, she also just acts like a crazy person. She stalks him. Again, he hadn't really made any direct moves on her or her daughter. It's implied that he did steal her car, so that actually was a point where she could have gone to the police and say, "Hey, I have something. I think he stole my car." But it gets to the point where she is acting so overbearing, so overprotective, and so erratic that the daughter literally has to escape from their apartment and go somewhere else. The climax of this movie takes place in some hotel room. This was like the final thing, come to me, and I still had no idea what his end goal in this movie was at all, really. But this was clearly going to be the end of it, and I was trying to put together what would be a good way to close this. And what I thought was going to happen was that she was going to completely drink the Kool Aid, fall into it, and then convince herself that she needed to cut the baby out of him, like literally cut his stomach open and pull the baby out. And he would either die because of the crazy monster he had created, or have the whole thing be revealed to be an elaborate ruse that Margaret and the police had set up, and she was like wearing a wire, and they were able to like get a taped confession that he murdered their baby all those years ago or something like that. And I was kind of right with my first interpretation. The second interpretation would have actually been kind of satisfying, but the first one where like she just like cuts his stomach open, that is what ends up happening, except she actually reaches into his intestines and pulls out a fetus. And then you see her like taking care of the baby at home and her daughter's back. And I think I was able to put together before they revealed this that this was just a delusion, because several times throughout the movie she would have a bad nightmare and then it would end with her gasping and waking up. And then it shows her like looking at her daughter holding her older but still somehow fetus little brother, and it sort of zooms into her face and her like face goes from a smile to like confusion to a frown, and then we hear the gasp and the movie ends. And even though I didn't really like Saint Maud, I did really like what they did at the very end, where just like for a brief moment they revealed how bad the delusions were and what was really happening, like just very shortly. They could have done that, but they didn't. Overall, Resurrection was just a mess. It had a weird, silly premise that I couldn't take all that seriously, characters that made no sense, and by the end of it, it really felt like nothing was accomplished. And yeah, that's about all I have to say about this movie. I'll see you tomorrow.